Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into a topic that's, well, let's be honest, it's both fascinating and a little unsettling. Propaganda.
Right.
Specifically, you've asked us to compare and contrast how two very different 20th century leaders, Hitler and Castro, use this powerful tool to shape their nations, to control people. We've got excerpts from a lecture that compares their methods. And I have to say, some of this stuff is truly eye-opening.
Yeah, it's a topic that's, I think, often misunderstood. People tend to think of propaganda as simply lying.
Right.
But it's so much more complex than that. It's about crafting narratives, appealing to emotions, and really shaping the way people see the world. And as we'll see, both Hitler and Castro were masters of this dark art.
The lecture, it doesn't waste any time. It jumps right into the sheer scale and organization of their propaganda machines. I was particularly struck by the level of control the Nazi regime exerted over every aspect of German life.
It was really about creating a total environment of belief.
Yeah.
In Nazi Germany, Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's minister of propaganda, he understood that effectiveness wasn't just about spreading a message. It was about ensuring that no other message could be heard.
He practically weaponized the media. This lecture excerpt mentions that by 1939, almost 70% of German households owned a radio. But what's really interesting is that this wasn't just a happy coincidence.
Right.
They had a program to subsidize the cost of these people's receivers, making them affordable for the working class.
Exactly. They understood that for propaganda to be truly effective, it had to be all-encompassing. It wasn't enough to just control the newspapers or the radio waves. They needed to reach into people's homes to make sure their message was the first thing people heard in the morning and the last thing they heard at night.
And then there were those infamous rallies. Meticulously staged events designed to evoke awe, a sense of belonging. Just imagine the sheer scale of it all. The marching bands, the torchlight parades, those massive crowds all chanting in unison. It's almost scary to think how effective that must have been at stirring up emotions and creating this feeling of unity.
It's about creating a shared experience, a collective identity that overrides individual thought.
Right.
The individual gets subsumed by the crowd, and the message, whatever it may be, takes on a power and urgency that it wouldn't have in isolation.
It makes you wonder about the psychology of it all. Did people truly believe, or were they simply swept up by the moment?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's something that continues to fascinate historians and psychologists to this day. But what's interesting is that while Hitler utilized this grand, almost theatrical style of propaganda, Castro adopted a slightly different approach.
Right. Castro was all about direct personal connection.
Yeah.
Less about the massive rallies and more about cultivating an image of accessibility through constant media appearances and those legendary marathon speeches.
Yes.
He wanted to be seen as one of the people, a man of the people.
Precisely. It's a fascinating contrast in styles, and it speaks to the different contexts in which they were operating. Hitler was selling a vision of national revival, of restoring Germany to its former glory.
Which meant appealing to a sense of wounded pride and a yearning for a stronger leader.
Exactly. Whereas Castro, having just overthrown a dictator, was selling a vision of revolution, of liberation, and of social justice. He needed to connect with people on a more personal level, to position himself as a champion of the downtrodden, fighting for their rights and aspirations.
And that's where his charisma and his ability to connect with people on an emotional level really came into play.
Absolutely. He understood that to maintain his grip on power, he needed to maintain the support of the people. And that meant cultivating a certain image, a certain narrative.
This lecture excerpt mentions a speech he gave at the UN General Assembly in 1960, where he basically positioned himself as this global voice for the oppressed, speaking out against global inequality and of course, railing against U.S. imperialism.
A masterful example of utilizing an international platform to further his own domestic agenda.
Right.
By aligning himself with other anti-colonial movements, he was able to legitimize his own revolution in the eyes of the world.
It's incredible to think how effectively both leaders were able to control the narrative and shape public perception. And it makes you wonder what were some of the specific tactics they used to achieve this level of influence?
One of the tactics that really stands out is their use of symbols.
Oh, absolutely.
Both Hitler and Castro, they understood that symbols could be incredibly potent tools for conveying meaning and evoking those emotional responses.
And they weren't subtle about it either. In Nazi Germany, the swastika was everywhere.
Everywhere, on flags, uniforms, even children's toys.
Wow.
It became ubiquitous, inescapable.
Yeah.
And that was the point. It's almost like they were trying to saturate people's visual fields with these symbols to the point where they became deeply ingrained in the fabric of everyday life.
Right.
Exactly. And by associating the swastika with their ideology, with their vision for Germany, they were essentially embedding that ideology into the very environment.
And it worked. Even today, the swastika evokes this visceral reaction. It's a chilling reminder of the power of symbols.
Castro took a slightly different approach with his use of symbols, but it was no less effective. Instead of a single all-encompassing emblem like the swastika, he focused on imagery that reinforced his image as a revolutionary hero, a man of the people.
Right. The lecture mentioned those posters depicting Castro with the Cuban flag, often in military fatigues, with this determined look on his face.
Mm-hmm. It was about projecting strength, defiance, and unity, and it worked brilliantly, especially in those early years after the revolution. People were looking for a leader, someone to believe in, and those images of Castro offered them just that.
It's fascinating how both regimes used imagery so effectively, even if the specific symbols and their meanings were quite different. But their use of propaganda went far beyond just symbols, didn't it? This lecture excerpt also delves into how they used their platforms to demonize their enemies.
Absolutely. Both Hitler and Castro were masters of what we might call the us versus them narrative.
Right.
They understood that a key element of successful propaganda is creating a common enemy, a scapegoat to rally against.
And for Hitler, that scapegoat was, well, tragically, it was multiple groups. Jews, communists, anyone deemed a threat to his vision of a pure German state.
Exactly. He used existing prejudices and anxieties, amplifying them to the point of mass hysteria.
Yeah.
And the truly horrifying thing is that it worked. By blaming these groups for Germany's problems, he was able to deflect criticism, consolidate power, and ultimately carry out his horrific plan.
Castro's tactics were different, though, right?
Yeah.
He wasn't advocating for genocide, but he definitely had his targets.
That's right. Castro's main target, at least in terms of his propaganda, was the United States.
Right.
He constantly railed against what he called Yankee imperialism, portraying the U.S. as this looming threat to Cuba's sovereignty and independence.
He really played up that whole David versus Goliath narrative, didn't he? Tiny Cuba standing up to the mighty United States.
It was a brilliant propaganda move, really. By positioning Cuba as this plucky underdog, he was able to rally support both domestically and internationally. After all, who doesn't love a good underdog story?
It's almost like they both understood something fundamental about human nature. We are drawn to stories, to narratives. And if you can control those narratives, you can control how people see the world.
Precisely. And that's what made their propaganda so insidious. It wasn't just about spreading lies. It was about shaping the very framework through which people process information.
So it wasn't just about what people thought, but how they thought.
Exactly. For example, in Nazi Germany, they didn't just promote their ideology, they actively suppressed any opposing viewpoints.
Right.
They shut down newspapers, censored books, and controlled the education system.
It's like that old saying, if you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it.
That's right. And if you can eliminate alternative narratives altogether, that lie becomes the only truth people know, which is a chilling reminder that access to a diversity of viewpoints is essential for a healthy society.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Without it, we're all vulnerable to manipulation. So how do we guard against that? How do we become more discerning consumers of information, especially in today's world where misinformation spreads like wildfire? It's like we're living in the information age, but also the misinformation age.
Precisely. We're constantly bombarded with information from all sides.
Yeah.
And it can be incredibly difficult to sift through it all and figure out what's true, what's biased, and what's outright propaganda.
So given everything we've discussed about Hitler and Castro, what can we learn from them? Not to emulate them, obviously, but to protect ourselves from falling prey to those same tactics?
That's the key question, isn't it? For me, it all comes down to critical thinking.
All right.
We need to be aware of the techniques of propaganda. We need to be skeptical of information that confirms our existing biases.
Right.
And we need to actively seek out alternative viewpoints.
Easier said than done sometimes, though, right?
Absolutely. It takes effort.
Yeah.
It means being willing to question our own assumptions,
Right.
to be open to the possibility that we might be wrong. But in today's world, those are essential skills.
It's almost like we need to develop a healthy distrust of information.
In a way, yes. I wouldn't say distrust necessarily, but certainly a healthy dose of skepticism.
Okay.
Don't just accept everything you see or hear at face value. Ask yourself, who's sending this message? What are their motivations? Are there other perspectives I'm not being shown?
It's that old adage, trust but verify.
Yeah.
And with so many sources of information vying for our attention these days, verification is more important than ever.
Exactly. And that's where things get tricky.
Yeah.
It used to be that we could rely on certain gatekeepers, journalists, academics, experts in their fields
Right.
to filter out the noise and give us accurate information. But today, the lines are much more blurred.
With social media, everyone's an expert, or at least they play one online.
Exactly. So it's up to us as individuals to develop those critical thinking skills,
Right.
to be discerning consumers of information.
So what's one concrete step we can take today to be more discerning?
One simple but powerful thing is to diversify your information diet.
Okay.
Don't just consume news and information from sources that align with your existing views.
Mm-hmm.
Seek out different perspectives, even if they make you uncomfortable.
It's about challenging our own echo chamber.
Exactly, because when we're only exposed to information that reinforces what we already believe, it becomes very easy to fall prey to propaganda and misinformation.
This deep dive has it's really been eye-opening. I have to say, learning about the techniques used by Hitler and Castro, it's chilling to see how those same tactics are still being used today, even if they're more subtle.
It's a reminder that the principles of propaganda are timeless. They prey on our fears, our desires, our need to belong.
So what's the takeaway? What's the one thing you hope listeners will take away from this deep dive?
That they have the power to resist.
Okay.
Propaganda only works if we let it. By being aware, by asking questions, by thinking critically, we can inoculate ourselves against its insidious effects.
Well said. Knowledge is power, and the more we understand about the techniques of propaganda, the better equipped we are to resist its influence.
Absolutely. And in a world awash in information, that's more important than ever.
So until next time, keep asking questions, keep seeking out different perspectives, and never stop thinking critically. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.